Happiness is beautiful, it's a kind of reality. Happiness is the highest good, happiness is free. So let's be so very happy. Yeah, let's be so very happy. Yeah, let's be so very happy.
Welcome to the Happiness Show. This is Lionel Ketchian, and I'm here with George Ortega. And we're here because happiness is, always has been, and always will be the point of it all. Today, we're going to be talking about happiness and surviving cancer. You, or maybe someone you know close to you in your life, has got cancer. They're fighting for their life, possibly, or maybe they should be. And that's what the focus of today's show is on. So, George, we're very fortunate to have with us Alden Harris. Welcome to the Happiness Show, Alden.
Thank you, Lionel. Thank you, George.
It's great to have you. And why don't we begin by having you tell us a little bit about the fact that you're still here now, and maybe about what that really meant to you and what your journey is encompassed.
Well, the story begins in 1967. When I found that I had a growth on my forearm that looked a little suspicious. In fact, a doctor friend of mine said, you better have that checked out. So I did, and went to a local doctor, a surgeon, and he excised it, and found that in the biopsy that it was melanoma, which, as you know, is the most serious form of skin cancer and very often lethal. And however, he said, well, we think we got it all out, the margins are clear, and it was just a simple excision. And I didn't worry too much about it, put a bandage around it. I happened to give a talk later that day to my club that I was president of the time, and went about my business. And he said, this could be dangerous, but we think we got it all out. So I was kind of assured that everything would be all right, but it was in the back of my mind. When 5 years passed in 1972, I thought, well, I'm free now, because I had always heard that 5 years is the magic number, which isn't necessarily true. Mm-hmm. But it happens that 2 years later, in 1974, by the way, in 1967, I was 37, 74, 44, and the next part of the story is 1976 when I was 46. But in 1974, I had noticed that there were lumps under my arm, and knowing that when I had a medical examination, the doctor always checked under the arms, I thought, well, this is suspicious. It's where the lymph nodes are. So I went immediately, and that I think was very important, to the doctor, and they found that yes, that was suspicious. It looks like a swollen lymph node. So they thought it would be metastases of the melanoma. Mm-hmm. So I decided that instead of staying local, I would go to Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital, which was renowned as one of the best cancer centers. And yes, they thought that should be taken care of, and they did a radical axillary node dissection, which in my case removed almost all of the lymph nodes. And it had spread to that point, and then it got pretty serious.
Mm-hmm. To give an idea on your own knowledge, I mean, basically, what does that mean, almost all of the lymph nodes, in terms of math?
Well, I remember the doctor saying we had to take 14 out of the 16 lymph nodes. I'm not sure those numbers are right. The doctors may correct me on it, but that's what I remember. But in any case, almost all of them were effective. You could have just one or two effective, but apparently this had taken time and taken the toll of almost all the lymph nodes. So I have a big hole in my, not hole at this point, but it was all taken out. It's a crevice there in my shoulder. Mm-hmm. And then at that point, it was getting serious, and of course I was getting concerned, obviously. And they suggested that I go to an immunology experimental course where they were administering BCG, which had been used years before for tuberculosis, but they thought that it would stimulate the immune system. So I underwent that program for about a year, where I was putting splotches on my knees, on my legs, on my arm, and so forth, and I had all these scars, and I had to do that myself. I believe it was once a week, and I'd go back to the hospital in New York every once a week. And I was in this group where everybody was doing this, undergoing this experimental program. There were people from all over the world there, because people who could afford it, from South America, from China, whatever. This was kind of their last hope, because this was a serious stage of melanoma. Mm-hmm. So they were all undergoing this experimental program. And however, 2 years later, there was another metastases in myself. Now, I had heard afterwards that out of these people, of maybe 35 or 40 people, that I was the only one who survived it. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure of that fact, but when I asked my surgeon, how's Mary, he would shake his head, how's Joe? And, then he finally said, don't ask anymore. And I surmised that if there were anybody alive, he'd say, well, Bill is okay. Anyway, I think that I was the only one who survived that stage of it. But 2 years later, I got a recurrence, and they knew there's no reason to continue this. Apparently, what they were doing did not work as an experiment, and they abandoned that idea of stimulating your immune system. At that point, I noticed that there was a growth on my knee on the opposite side of my body. Went from here to here to here. So at that point, of course, it got very serious. 1976, I was 46 years old. By the way, when my first episode happened, my older daughter was 1 year old. My younger daughter hadn't been born yet. By the time of 1976, they were 11 and 7. And so this was getting very serious, and they suggested chemotherapy. They suggested I take DTIC and Cytoxin and 2 other things. I remember one of the nurses asked me what chemos I'd be on. I said it, and she screamed as if, this is
because
terrible.
basically you're taking poison.
That's right. So I started that program. And the doctors then told me that to get my affairs in order, to get my insurance in order, get a gravesite, whatever I had to do, because I had only a few months to live. And I never felt as if I was going to die, but I thought I would, because this is what they told me. I went to other doctors to get another opinion. They all corroborated what the doctors in New York said, that I only have a few months, and as one put it, anything is possible, but it's kind of 1,000,000 to 1 that you'll be around for much more than a few months or a year, whatever. So I got ready to die, I guess, and yet I didn't feel that bad and didn't feel that sick and so forth. By the way, many of the doctors were very callous, and they would tell me things that were exaggerated. Undergoing the surgery, one doctor had told me, well, we may have to take your arm off during the surgery, we may have to take your lung out, we'll see what we find. And this is what I thought might be the possibility, until the surgeon, who was a great guy, and he was the only positive one, he kept on saying, you're going to be fine. I didn't believe it, but it was nice to hear it. And he said, no, I'm not going to do any more but remove the lymph nodes. If there's anything more that has to be done, we'll do it in the future. But don't worry about how you're going to wake up, because up until that point, the night before, I thought that could be the case. So I had the lymph nodes removed, and they didn't recommend anything else, but I went on the the next stage, I went on the chemotherapy, those items. And it was difficult, but I was a young man. I wasn't ready to die. I had to go back to my business. I would take my chemotherapy, and the next day I was always back at my business.
You were 44 years old at this stage?
I was 46 at that point.
46, okay.
And by the way, these daughters who were one was -3, she hadn't been born yet, one was 1, they're now 38 and 34.
Okay.
And I have grandchildren and so forth. At the time, I remember that I would, I didn't tell my daughters at that time, of course now they know, but I didn't tell them what was going on, but we were skiers, and I would say, as we went out to dinner that summer, I'd say, well, this summer when you're going down the ski run, take a run for me, figuring that if I died, they'd kind of think of that, even though I wasn't telling them what was going to happen. And I spent a lot more time with them, although I had spent time before, but I would go to their camps and so forth, because I was out of my office for a couple of weeks, taking a little bit of a break. I think the story that you particularly like, Lionel, is the fact that each of the 3 times, well, the second and third times, I should say, when I was told that it was getting very serious and I might not have long to live, I would go to bed for a day, and at the time they had these digital clocks. Before actually the flip-flop clocks, the ones that the numbers fall down, and every minute another number would. And I figured out by my calculator that, well, if I have 3 or 4 months, I've got so many thousands of minutes, so it's not so bad. I would watch the minutes, and I thought if I stayed in bed, then it would go more slowly, and I've got all this time. But after a day, I came to my senses and said, hey, if I'm really going to die and I only have a few months, I'm not going to waste it in bed. And if I live longer, it's certainly pretty stupid to be in bed.
If I may interrupt for a moment, I think that is the greatest wisdom. That alone, in a nutshell, is what I consider the power of happiness right there, right in that statement you just made. Because how much time do we all know that we've got, and how do we use it is the other question. But you were at a different level of understanding what we all don't always know. I mean, if this was our last day, or we only had a few months to live, how would we live? You actually had that situation, and I think what I would consider the decision that you made has really made all the difference, because although you hadn't read Dr. Bernie Siegel's books back then, and you've read them since, you've said to me that you actually were that exceptional patient. You really were doing many of the things that Bernie Siegel would talk about in his books. You were practicing. You were that patient that was questioning everything, and I think this is the reason you survived. That's my own personal
I think it
opinion.
has certainly a lot to. Certainly, the surgery was necessary to get that stuff out before it spread too much more than it did. Whether the chemotherapy worked or not, I don't know. The immunotherapy certainly didn't. But many of the people that I was in that experimental group with, that I think died, many of them would sit back and say, well, I'm going to go back to my farm now, I'm going to sit on the porch and just wait for it to happen, and with no thought that they might survive. And I wasn't ready. I was a young man, and I had a young family, and I wasn't ready to do that. And I would bother the doctors and ask a lot of questions, and what are my odds, and what's going to happen. And according to Bernie Siegel, I read his book maybe 15 years ago. I'm reading another one of his books now that I just happened to pick up. And he talks about this, that a small percentage of the people react in that way, where they fight it and they ask a lot of questions and bother the doctors about what's going to happen, because it's your life you're talking about.
Now, didn't you, when you felt that you were told and diagnosed that you may only have a few months to live, didn't you stop and think about your life then as a father of, you had two children,
daughters, yes.
two daughters.
Yes.
One was one, right?
At the first stage, one hadn't been born. One
Right.
was going to be born 3 years later.
Okay.
But then it wasn't that
You
serious.
had young children.
But by the second and third stage, they
Right.
were 11 and 7.
So you kind of said to yourself, you really didn't want to die.
Oh, yes.
Okay,
Yes,
but that was a thought in your head. You weren't ready,
No.
and that's when you sort of consciously went out and started living.
Well, that's another thing. As time went by, during particularly these 3 or 4 years of this very difficult time, but I did. We went on vacation and so forth. But yes, afterwards, I think I didn't take things for granted as much as I had before. I tried to enjoy more things that I could, and I think I've told you some stories about. Well, for one thing, when I was in the hospital in Memorial Sloan Kettering, I had a very, very nice single room there, and some friends who came to visit me, because perhaps they were a little awkward in that situation, would say, "Oh, what a beautiful room you have." And I thought to myself, I said, "Well, who cares what a beautiful room I have? I'm going under surgery, and I may be dead in a short time, so I don't care what a room I have." But I vowed within myself at the time to think that in the future, if I'm on vacation and I have a lousy room, I'm never going to complain. I'm going to enjoy that vacation, and because I'll think back at this time that I had the beautiful room and what it'd mean if under the situation. And also, there's another incident I had mentioned to you, Lionel, that once my wife and I and kids were at a hotel in Cancun, a very beautiful hotel, had just been redone, but next door to us was an older hotel that hadn't been taken down and rebuilt as many hotels were there. And I was on the beach, and I happened to meet this woman who was with her husband, and I asked her, "How are you enjoying the vacation?" And, "Oh, it's terrible. I've got a terrible room. This hotel is terrible." And I told her my story about the room I had at Memorial, and I said, "Why don't you enjoy this vacation? Whatever it is, your room, you're going to." And she said, "Yes, I'm going to do that." And so I'm sure she had a better time, because she then was able to forget about the disappointment of the room and enjoy the fact that she's on vacation.
Okay, well, now I want to connect this as directly as possible to happiness, because there are a few phases that you experienced, difficulties, situations that, of course, weren't in your best interest, or perhaps, and you had to deal with them not just for your sake, but for the sake of those around you, like your family. So, firstly, let's begin with when you first found out about the diagnosis and the seriousness of it. You did fight, okay, which was great. But then, how did you also maintain your positivity for yourself and your family?
Well, I don't think I felt as if I was fighting. I just was angry. And as we've said before, my first thought was, why me? And then I realized, why not me? It could be me as well as anything else.
Well, if I may, one of the things you said, and I think this is important to say, that yes, you came through it, but at first you went through anger, you went through self-pity, but the point, denial. But the point is, you overcame those things, but you had to go through them first.
Yes,
I mean, I think is important.
Well, sure. I mean, there must have been a stage, but I think you didn't spend those years where you had the 3 occurrences of it not feeling good, I would imagine, right? I mean,
right.
So
I never felt bad physically, except after the surgery, whatever. But it's never as if I felt that sick. I didn't feel as if I were going to die, but I thought I would, because that's what I was told.
So then,
But you asked how I maintain the relationship with my children. So I just thought it was very important. Perhaps I felt I wanted them to remember me in a positive way and not as a dying sick man, and we did a lot of things. We skied and we went on vacation and so forth. My wife was very helpful and reassuring during those periods. She had the problem of when we went to Sloan Kettering and I had my chemotherapy, we had to drive back, and I was throwing up in the car and not in a bag. But I mean, it wasn't very pleasant for her. But she was always by my side and encouraging me and helping make it somewhat easier.
Right.
Right, because I mean, there's the optimism, that the belief that you will get through it, and that, I think, is going to lead to happiness. But then there's also maybe, as part of your thinking, the possibility that you might not.
Right.
But your goal before this happened, as is the goal of most of us, is to just enjoy life as much as possible. And I'm sure it was your goal at this time also. So what was it? How did you come to terms with that possibility that you may not be around, or even just like with the whole situation? How did you retain your level of happiness through the whole thing?
Well, I don't know if I did retain my level of happiness. I think that gradually returned to me. Okay. But I think it was more of an angry, fighting kind of an attitude I had. Not that I was running around happy because I had, or despite the fact that I had cancer. So I think that was more than it. And as we talked about before, looking back, well, it's since 1976 that I've been cancer-free. They don't know why. As a matter of fact, in Dr. Bernie Siegel's book that I'm reading now, he said that if you let it go beyond the first, or it goes beyond the first stage, he said it's very unlikely that you'll survive. So catch it early in the first stage. But as I was saying, it was 1976, my last episode. But it wasn't as if in 1976 I said, okay, I'm home free now. For many years I thought it still would return because that's what I was told. And looking back, it's 35 years approximately. But now I feel pretty clear. And in any case, I'm older, so that it's.
You made it.
I made it so far. I'm not going to make it continually. But and as a. If I had a recurrence of some kind of cancer or something, I don't know if I could fight the same way because I'm older now. It's more appropriate. Then I was angry because I was just 30.
But you're not faced with that, so it's just a what-if situation.
Yeah,
but boy, when you're put to the test, you do a pretty good job of it, I must say.
Thank you.
And you didn't do it once. You did it three times or 3 episodes.
Yeah.
Now, we talked about, okay, who was Alden before and who was he after? And you sort of related some stories to me about, for example, I'll let you take it from here. You go for walks on the beach with a friend, and you mentioned something about a time when you were taking a walk with your friend.
Yes, well, yes. We take walks for exercise. My very close friend Richard, and he happens to be a retired doctor.
Well, let's say his name, Richard Ellis. He comes to our Happiness Club meetings.
Right. Very good friend of mine.
He is, and he's a wonderful human being, and he loves happiness.
That's right. But we'd walk along and at a very fast pace to get the exercise and so forth. And I would stop and say, let's enjoy the surroundings. This is so beautiful. And I think at first he wondered, well, why are we doing this? But now he reminds me that he does it now by himself, and it's just enjoy what you're seeing, not only for the walk, but for the beauty of the place. And I think I've grown not to take a lot of things for granted. I enjoy very much the sensual pleasures of life and swimming in the ocean and outdoors and so forth.
So yeah, could you then is it possible that you learned more about happiness, that you perhaps became happier because of the experience than if you hadn't gone through it at all?
Yes, I think it has enhanced my life. I wouldn't advise anybody going through it. But I mean, I think that I was taking too many things for granted. Before that time, I was very, very much involved in my business, which I was afterwards, but I made sure I took vacations and vacations at whatever time of the year that were enjoyable, whereas before I was in a seasonal business and I wouldn't go away in the winter, but I felt nothing terrible has happened because of it.
Yeah, I'm reminded, George, as you raised that question, Alden, Bernie talks about the fact that people who have overcome cancer, as you have, actually say that they didn't want it. If they could do it all over again, they'd rather not have it, but it changed their life to something much more positive.
Yes.
They learned from that. They changed. They grew. And I think that's what you're relating to us.
I think that's true, yes.
So what is a good... what is your definition? What should exceptional cancer patients do? I mean, what do they do to fight for their life?
Don't
and win.
listen to the doctors. I mean, do the things perhaps they prescribe that will make you better as far as the pharmaceuticals and so forth. But I mean, when they tell you, if you should be in such a situation that you're told you have a few months to live, in the first place, doctors shouldn't say that.
Yes.
Because it sometimes doesn't happen. And if they give you no hope...
False despair.
And I'm afraid some people die because they're told they're going to die.
Yeah.
And
they die on
that's
cue.
Very sad. And
Yeah.
I don't know if I should say this, but I think many doctors, particularly in the oncology field, perhaps are in there because they don't have the greatest bedside manner, and they are very apt to tell you things that are worse than what will be really. There was no reason I had to be told that there's 1 out of a million, because I'm sure it's not that great odds if I'm here.
Right. In fact, there was a situation where just when you were getting ready for chemo, you related to me that they found a spot on your lung, and they said, hey, we may have to take your lung out. We may not be able to give you chemo. So you went out and had lunch and then came back, and you could...
No, this was during the period. Maybe it was 3 months after I began. I went into New York with my wife every week, and we had the chemo treatments, then drove home. And as I say, she was wonderful in helping along those times. I certainly couldn't have driven myself and so on. But anyway, I was you eat very little before the day of chemo, and the fact that I was going from Connecticut, it took an hour to get there, and so I had a very, very light or almost nothing for breakfast, a sip of juice or whatever, because you're going to be bringing it all up. So I went in there, and they did the normal tests before the chemo was supposed to be given me. And one nurse said, well, we found a spot on your lung, so I guess it's spread to your lung, so we'll probably have to take your lung out. And she said, but you're young, you're strong, you probably can withstand that. So, but we're not going to give you chemo today because it's already spread, so there's no point to giving you the chemo. So instead of just sitting there and waiting around, I said to my wife, let's go out for lunch. It happens that Maxwell's Plum was nearby, Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital. And that was a very popular, very active place. And we went there, and I had 2 martinis, and I had a big lunch, and said, the heck with it, I'm going to enjoy myself. Whatever it is, the lung I'll worry about later. Then I went back to the hospital, I guess, to just wind up things there. And they said, oh, we're sorry that we made a mistake. It wasn't a spot on your lung. It was a spot on the x-ray. So we are going to resume the chemo. You can either have it done today or come in tomorrow. And I wasn't about to come back tomorrow. I had to be at my business and so forth. So, of course, it was one of the worst days of my life, because you can imagine eating all this food and the martinis and all, and I was taking the chemo, and, of course, you bring it all up. And,
okay,
sure.
You were mentioning how, like, the doctors, some of them just didn't express enough sensitivity or empathy regarding your experience. And you were also in a kind of a similar position where you had to not just address your welfare and happiness, but the happiness, again, of those around you, your family and friends. So how is it, what did you do, what did you say to help them through the experience so they could, maintain their level of happiness as well?
Well, I didn't tell my daughters about it, and I don't think they even suspected it. I think we lived our life as we normally had, and as I said before, such things as I would say, take a run for me. So in case I weren't there, that they would remember, hey, that Dad really knew he might not be here.
Well, I think that's very important, because I think a lot of us might feel that we have the responsibility to tell those around us about something like that. But it may be much wiser and much kinder to not, say things, not tell people things that may not be necessary for them to know and may just be very harmful for them.
Well, they were children at the time. I think if they were adults, and I have told them, of course, over the years, but if they were adults, I think it would have been smarter to tell them about it so they know what to expect. And however, that brings up an interesting point. Now everything is open. They no longer call it the C or the CA or whatever they call it, cancer. At that time, things were very secretive. A person would never say he had cancer because that's too terrible thing to conceive of. So I only told a few very close friends about it. Most of my acquaintances or social contacts, I didn't tell at all. And it was kind of good in a way. I guess it's better to be open and all, but the ones who did know, every time they'd see me, they'd say, oh, you look great, you look fine, you haven't lost any weight. And it would bring it to my mind and make kind of a awkward situation where if they didn't know, it would be like it didn't happen.
Yes.
I wouldn't be thinking about it myself that much. But the few people that do know, always said, hey, you look great.
So I think that's a very good question. I'm not sure it's better to tell people, even if they're adults. Sometimes it's just, like you were saying, it just brings up something that just may not be necessary, and then you could relate on a more real basis, sure.
Although if you do tell more people and more people know, you get a better support system if you know the right people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I've talked to people who were undergoing this same trauma that I did. I would have loved to have met someone like myself then.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Who had survived. And I talk to people, and I think it helps them, but of course, not always does it work out.
Well, you know, there's somebody listening right now who either has cancer and is fighting it, or has had cancer, or has cancer in somebody in their family. And, you know, they're listening to you and saying, hey, I just listened to a guy that beat cancer. You know, he's given 1,000,000 to 1 odds, given a few months to live, and lived. Can you add anything to this person for them to be empowered even more than you have?
Interesting question, because I'm thinking of these things as we talk. There was an employee of mine in our business. He drove a truck, and he did pool work in the summertime and so forth, and I was very fond of him, nice guy. And all of a sudden, one year, I heard that he had committed suicide. And in looking more into it, he had cancer and decided to commit suicide. I assume one was related to the other. So I only wish that he would have talked to me. Of course, he didn't know my history, and I didn't know his.
I see.
But, you know, perhaps I could have helped, because wouldn't it be a shame if he could have survived and he heard the word cancer and figured he's going to die, so he committed suicide.
Well, this brings up George's question, where telling people, you know, we're having this discussion about I think telling people is a good thing, because maybe you can help other people, and maybe they can help you.
Well, at your happiness club, which I've enjoyed, you asked me to speak about my experience and so forth. And many people came up to me afterwards and said how much they got out of it. One woman, I think you told me later, was going into the hospital
the next morning for a cancer operation. Yes.
Yeah, and I don't know.
And she did fine.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
But I don't know which one it was, because, of course, you couldn't tell me. But a few people said it very emotionally, that they really appreciated what I told them, and the implication was it gave them hope.
Yeah, I think even more than hope, I think you're giving people the ability to cope, and I think the ability to cope is important, and I think that ability transcends the normal urges that pop up immediately: anger, frustration, self-pity, and then what you're bringing up, really coping with the situation, transcending even yourself, and finding out that you can overcome it. I mean, it's wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
And you've also got to be lucky. Otherwise, I could have done the same thing, and it might not have worked out. But I think to give yourself a better chance, I think attitude is very important.
Yeah, I think that may be the key. I mean, there are many people who didn't survive, and maybe attitude is the factor that made the difference. Yeah.
Well, I think attitude is extremely important. Is it everything? I might almost say yes, but you know, nothing is everything, but it sure is a big part of it, and I think it helps everything else you do. But believe it or not, gentlemen, Alden, thanks so very much for being on the show. You've contributed greatly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that's about all we have time for today. Thanks for watching. In the future, we'll explore other topics designed to help us better enjoy life, be good, think well, be very happy. We'll see you again next week.
Happiness is powerful, it's our underlying need. Happiness is why we live each day. Happiness is destiny, so let's be so very happy. Yeah, let's be so very happy. Yeah, let's be so very happy.